My son published my obituary while I was still breathing, so I printed it, filed it, and called my lawyer. In the next few minutes, you'll learn why some silences aren't confusion. They're strategy. I raised him. I kept the pills sorted, the lights on, the records straight. Then I discovered what he did with my name, how a paper I never signed unlocked my trust. He thought I wouldn't notice, that I'd stay quiet, that grandmothers don't push back. Thank you for being here. Have you ever done everything right and been told just too much or not all there? Leave a comment, just one word. Tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is where you are. And if quiet, powerful stories speak to you, don't forget to subscribe for more. This is my story, Zinla's story, and it's not what you think. I set the phone down and looked at the memorial again, my name centered like a neat little tomb. Steam still clung to the kettle. The house hummed in its ordinary way as if nothing had shifted but me. I slid the page into a manila folder, wrote proof on the tab, and set it next to the stove. The peach magnet on my fridge held the grocery list: eggs, paper towels, coffee. And for a beat, I pictured pinning my own death between staples. I rinsed a cup for something to do with my hands and listened to the clock tick like it was counting me back into myself. No speeches, I told my reflection in the dark window. Just steps. The first step was done. Gather proof, keep it safe, and move forward. The second would be listening for the small lies that gather around a big one. I took a breath that tasted like metal and soap and checked the pen in my pocket. If they buried me on paper, I would answer on paper. I called the bank. The menu asked me to say representative, and I did because I wanted a person, not a loop. A young man came on, polite and brisk, and ran through security. I answered everything without thinking. Then his tone shifted, and he said there was an authorized family representative on file, and he'd need to transfer me. The hold music smiled at me through the phone while my jaw tightened. When he came back, he said he couldn't discuss any changes without that representative present. I told him I had never appointed one. He said the system showed otherwise. I asked for the date the authorization was added. He said he couldn't share that. I asked for a case number and for a fraud flag to be placed on my account. He hesitated, then read me a string of letters and numbers. I wrote it clean, thanked him in a tone that meant we were finished, and set the phone down like it might bite. Paper is slow, but it doesn't lie if you read it in layers. I stacked pension statements, trust summaries, mortgage escrow, and my small spiral notebook where I chart pills on Sundays. At the bottom of last month's update, the signature was almost mine. Almost is where trouble lives. My Z carries a hook at the start, the one on the page curled smooth and pretty like someone practicing in a mirror. The pen pressure lightened midway, the way a left hand fakes a right. I've watched enough consent forms signed at 3 a.m. to hear when a pen is lying. In the margin, I wrote, compare prior signatures, and circled the hook 3 times. The room felt like it tilted a degree, not enough to fall, but enough to reach for the table. This wasn't a clerk's oops. This was a choice made by someone who believed I wouldn't push back. I laid the suspect page on top where it could stare at me while I worked. The church office answered on the second ring. The secretary, who usually tells me about her grandbabies, sounded like she was filing the edges off her words. I asked when the memorial list went to print and who submitted my name. She murmured that it came from family, her pause revealing more than her words. Which family member? I asked. She said she'd have to check the email thread and call me back. I could hear paper shuffle, a stapler thump, a chair creak. I thanked her, left my number, and wrote the time, her full name, and the gist of what she'd said in my notebook. If she didn't call, I'd walk in with my folder and ask to see the submission. If refused, I'd ask for the minutes from the newsletter team. Plans need a second plan when people get nervous. I hung up and listened to the household hold its breath with me. I walked to the branch library because my printer eats ink like a toddler eats cereal. The librarian waved me toward the public computers, and I pulled the bulletin up and printed 2 clean copies. I stapled them to the inside of the folder and wrote today's date in the corner, the way I used to timestamp medication changes. An older man at the next station asked what I was working on. I said, family paperwork, and he nodded like that explained the whole world. On the way home, I picked up a rotisserie chicken and a small sack of oranges because a body still needs fuel when a life is burning. At the register, the cashier called me ma'am with a softness that made me want to cry, and I decided not to. The wind shoved down the block, cold and clean, and I walked fast, counting mailboxes like they were steps on a staircase. My front door stuck like it always does. I should sand it, I thought, and smiled because maintenance is a promise to yourself. I set the chicken on the counter, the folder beside it, and sorted the mail. 2 coupons, a church flyer, and a notice from the mortgage servicer with bold letters pretending to be urgent. I slit the envelope and read that my autopay had been suspended at the request of a caregiver. I stood very still and read it again. I have no caregiver, I said to the room, and the room was loyal and kept my secret. I grabbed my keys and walked to the pharmacy for my refill to see what else had moved without me. The tech scanned my card, frowned, and asked if she could verify the new insurance number on file. I told her there was no new number. She apologized and reset it, and I thanked her for doing her actual job. Back home, I logged each change in my notebook. Bank list representative, church printed memorial, mortgage autopay suspended, pharmacy attempted update. The pattern wasn't elegant yet, but it was forming. A net I could start to pull. I called my son and let it ring to voicemail, then said, "Call me. There are documents with my name that I did not sign." I put the phone face down so it couldn't stare at me and tell a story I didn't want. Then I slid the folder to the center of the tab, the way a nurse lays a chart before a hard conversation, and wrote 3 questions. Who sent the memorial? Who added the representation? And who gains if I'm quiet? I woke early. The folder still on the table where I had left it, its manila cover swollen with papers that felt heavier than their weight. My coffee steamed beside it, but my eyes stayed on the page where my signature had been twisted into something polished and false. Who practiced that hand until it looked like mine? The thought made me tap the pen against my mug until the rim sang. I decided I would need to call the records department at the county clerk's office. Not because I expected cooperation, but because paper trails usually left crumbs for those willing to kneel down and look. I dialed, pressed through menus, and repeated my information until the clerk on the other end finally agreed to send me a notarized copy of the authorization on file. I asked for the notary ID, and she said it was listed but unreadable on her screen like smudged ink. I hung up and wrote it in my notebook anyway, a blank space where truth should have lived. The weight gnawed at me, so I turned to the trust binder again, flipping through pages I had memorized but pretended not to. The amendments section looked too neat, almost staged, as if someone had taken extra care to straighten the pages. I saw the same clean curve on the Zod, the same practiced loop on the L, and my stomach turned because this was not an accident repeated twice. A memory came uninvited. Malik at the kitchen table when he was 12, trying to copy my handwriting for a Mother's Day card, his letters oversized and eager. Back then it was love, now it was theft disguised as authority. I pulled out a magnifying glass I used once for needlework and traced the ink strokes. The line was consistent, like someone had leaned hard on a template. Who had the patience to forge patience? I felt the air in the room grow stale, the kind that makes you open a window just to remember you can breathe. By mid-morning, the mail truck groaned down the block, and I met it at the curb with a heart that didn't trust itself. Inside was the copy from the clerk, sealed with a thin strip of tape, official enough to bruise me before I opened it. I slid it open and found the notarized form, a page with my name, a false signature, and a bold black stamp. The notary's name read Jacob's Notary Services, a name I didn't recognize, though the address on file was a town an hour away. I stared at the date. 2 months back, a Tuesday when I had been home folding laundry and watching the afternoon news. The stamp was tilted, sloppy, as if someone had rushed her or paid her to rush herself. I whispered, "Did she look at an ID or just nod when someone waved my name like a flag?" The road did not answer. I wrote the notary's name on the top of a fresh page and underlined it twice. After lunch, I drove to the church office because waiting for callbacks was a game for people with endless patience. The secretary looked up from her desk with a smile that flickered when she saw me carrying the folder like a weapon. I asked again who had submitted my name for the bulletin. She shifted in her chair, smoothed her skirt, and said, "Well, the note came from a trusted member of the congregation." I asked her to be precise. Trust is not a name. She hesitated, looked past me at the stained glass light shifting on the wall, and then said it had been Deacon Roy who forwarded the list. She said it quickly, like pulling off a bandage, and then looked at her keyboard as if it could rescue her. I thanked her, though my voice cracked sharp enough to leave a cut between us, and walked out before she could soften it with excuses. My hands shook on the folder's edges, but inside me the shaking felt like the beginning of a storm. Back home, I placed the new documents in order on the table and stared at the puzzle they made. A false signature with my name, a notary who stamped sloppily, a bank clerk who swore a family representative existed, and now a deacon's name tied to my obituary. Each piece had its own smell of dishonesty, and together they filled the kitchen with a heaviness that pressed against my ribs. I thought of Malik, of his silence on the phone, and wondered if his face would flinch when I laid these pages before him. My fear was not of confrontation, but of confirmation, that my son might have been the one to open this door and let others walk through. I brewed more coffee, the bitter kind that coats your mouth with courage, and said under my breath to myself that tomorrow I would bring this folder to someone who could not ignore me. For tonight, I pinned the notary's name and Roy's to the wall above the table, words staring back like unfinished prayers, daring me to speak them out loud. The morning after I wrote down Roy's name, I called 3 friends whose voices had carried me through other storms. Hattie picked up first, her laugh like gravel that never quite smooths, and I told her I needed her eyes on something. Yolanda answered second, already suspicious because I never dial that early, and when I asked her to come over, she said, "What's wrong, Zinla? You sound weird." Pearl was last, her voice soft but steady, and when I explained I had papers that smelled wrong, she said she'd bring her glasses. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder spread open, the smell of strong coffee climbing into every corner, waiting for the 3 of them to arrive like jurors called to court. When the doorbell rang, I almost jumped, though I'd been watching the clock for the past hour. They came in carrying purses and shawls and curiosity, and I placed the folder in the middle of the table as if it were evidence on display. The room felt charged, my heart pounding like the walls themselves were listening for what we'd uncover. Hattie leaned forward first, her fingers rough from years in the garden, tapping the page with my false signature. She said, "This curl here isn't yours, Zinla. I've seen you sign checks since forever." I nodded, relief and anger mixed, because hearing someone else confirm it made the lie solid in a way my eyes alone couldn't. Yolanda took the magnifying glass and examined the notary stamp. Her eyebrows drawing down like she was threading a needle, she muttered that stamps are supposed to be clean, aligned, official, not tilting like someone shoved them at the last minute. Pearl sat quiet longer, then pointed at the loop in the letter L, whispering, "Whoever did this wanted it pretty, not real." I felt their words pressing against the silence, layer by layer, until the truth started forming a wall around me. It wasn't just me losing sleep. It was 3 other women recognizing the shape of fraud. Their faith in me patched the holes the lies had torn open. I thought, if I'm not crazy, then somebody is cruel. We decided to call the bank again while they were still here, 4 voices stronger than one. Yolanda put her phone on speaker, her tone sharp but polite, and demanded to know who authorized a representative on my account. The rep stumbled, said policy didn't allow that information without a release form, and Yolanda pressed harder, repeating the word fraud like it was a password. Finally, he admitted the request had been logged through an internal call, not online, and the caller claimed to be my son. My chest squeezed as if someone had reached through the phone line and grabbed me. Hattie breathed. "You knew it," and Pearl's hand covered mine, cool and steady, while Yolanda asked for the call log number. The rep read off a string of digits, and I wrote it down with letters shaking so badly the ink smeared. My mind ran circles. Malik's voice is deep and sure. Did the clerk not ask for ID, not confirm a single detail? Rage simmered with sorrow, an acid mix, and I said out loud, "If he wanted help, why steal my name to get it?" After the call, the kitchen buzzed with more than just conversation. It buzzed with the sound of women building strategy. Hattie suggested checking state records for the notary license, and Yolanda promised to look online that evening. Pearl said softly, "The church will not want to admit a deacon's name is tied to this, but you'll need to confront them." Her words landed like stones because I knew she was right, and the thought of standing in that sanctuary with all those eyes on me felt like walking into fire. But fire purifies, doesn't it? I told myself, even as fear gnawed at the edges of courage. I looked at the folder, pages bent and smudged now from so many hands, and thought it looked more alive than dead, as if truth itself resisted being buried. We sat in silence long enough to hear the ticking of the kitchen clock, and I realized silence can be louder than shouting when everyone's holding their breath. I poured another round of coffee, the bitterness grounding me in the moment. Then I said, "Tomorrow after service, I will ask Roy what he signed me up for." When they left, evening light spilled across the table, painting the papers gold and then dimming them into shadow. I ran my fingers over the notary's name again, over Roy's name scrawled in my notebook. and felt the weight of betrayal press into my chest. My son's possible voice on the bank call cut deeper than I wanted to admit, but I forced myself to breathe steadily and keep the folder open. Evidence was stronger than emotion if I wanted to win. I pinned the call log number to the fridge under that peach magnet, a placeholder for justice, and whispered to the empty kitchen that I would not fold. Tomorrow, I'd walk into the church with truth in my hands and demand answers under the stained glass. For tonight, I closed the folder but kept it on the table where I could see it, like a lantern against the dark. The questions swirled. Who else knew? Who else signed? And what did they think I was too blind to catch? My heart answered with a steady beat, promising I would not be quiet. Sunday morning air pressed cool and sharp as I walked into church, the folder tucked under my arm like contraband. The stained glass spilled red and blue light across the pews, and I wondered if lies looked different when God's sun shone through colored glass. I greeted neighbors with a smile that trembled at the edges, each handshake a test of whether they knew my name had been printed dead. The choir's voices rose sweet and steady, but I heard a dissonance underneath, the sound of suspicion that lived only in my chest. I slid into my usual seat, gripping the hymnal until my knuckles whitened, while my heart kept repeating the question. When did Roy decide my funeral was worth printing? I watched him across the sanctuary, his hands folded neatly, his mouth moving in prayer, and I thought of Yolanda's sharp tone when she said his name. The pastor spoke about trust being a covenant, not a contract, and I almost laughed because paper is exactly where my trust had been stolen. Every verse landed like an accusation I couldn't dodge. When the service ended, my legs shook, but I carried myself forward toward the man who had written me out of my own life. Roy saw me coming and offered a smile that stopped short of his eyes. He said, "Sister Zinla, good to see you," and his voice carried the weight of practiced warmth. I didn't return the smile. Instead, I placed the bulletin copy between us, the black letters spelling my death as boldly as scripture. I asked, "Who gave you this to send?" His hands twitched once, smoothing his tie, and he said it was just a clerical oversight. I told him that oversights don't forge signatures or create caregivers on bank accounts. His lips pressed thin, and for the first time I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, but the calculation of a man caught without a script. I leaned closer, my whisper sharp enough to slice, and said, "If you used my son to get this done, tell me now." The people passing by slowed their steps, curious without meaning to, and Roy glanced at them before muttering, "We should speak in private." I straightened and said, "Privacy is what thieves use. I prefer the truth in the open air." We moved to the side hall. Shadows long against the walls, the hum of voices muffled behind the sanctuary doors. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the motion of someone cornered, and I let the silence hang until it became unbearable. Finally, he said Malik had mentioned paperwork, that he was struggling to manage things for me, and that the church only wanted to support. My chest tightened at the sound of my son's name in his mouth, twisted into justification. I asked, "Did Malik give you my signature, or did you accept it without proof?" Roy avoided my eyes, staring at a spot on the wall as if it might speak for him. He muttered something about trust, about how families know best, and I felt fury crawl hot across my skin. I pressed again. "Who notarized it, Roy?" He shook his head and said he wasn't part of that step, just forwarding a request. I wrote his words down in my mind like evidence, every pause, every dodge. Then I told him, "The next time you carry my name, carry it honestly or not at all." When I walked out into the sunlight, the weight in my chest had shifted from fear to resolve. Children ran across the church lawn, their laughter sharp against the ache in my ribs, and I thought how betrayal always seems louder when joy is near. I sat on the bench near the old oak tree, opened my notebook, and wrote Roy's words in ink before they faded into doubt. The pages filled with questions. Who first forged? Who signed? Who gained? My pen dug so deep the tip tore the paper, as if even the ink wanted to scream. I looked up and saw Malik's car pulling into the lot, his shoulders stiff as he stepped out, his eyes catching mine from across the grass. He hesitated, one hand tightening on the door frame, and for a moment I saw the boy he had been, the boy who once copied my handwriting for love. Now I only saw the man who might have copied it for something colder. I murmured, "Lord, give me strength," because the next conversation would not be about Roy or notaries. It would be about blood and whether blood had betrayed me. The service crowd had thinned, leaving space for words too heavy to speak among others. Malik walked toward me slowly, each step measured like he was approaching a stranger, and my heart pounded with every inch he closed. I kept the folder across my lap, my fingers pressing against it as if it were armor. When he finally stopped in front of me, he said, "Mama, we need to talk." His voice was calm, but calm can be the sharpest blade, and I knew what waited in his throat wasn't comfort. I told him, "Yes, we do, but not with lies." The silence between us stretched thick as tar, and I felt the weight of every page, every forged line pressing against my back. The moment didn't end with answers, only with a question lodged deep in both of us. How far had he already gone? And how far was he willing to go? The folder felt heavier in my arms, as if truth itself demanded to be carried into the next battle. Malik stood in front of me like a man weighing how much truth he could spare, and I felt my body tense as if bracing for impact. His shoulders were set, but his eyes slipped past mine, landing on the folder across my lap. I asked him to sit, my voice even though my chest pounded. He lowered himself onto the bench with the stiffness of someone sitting on broken glass. For a moment, we both listened to the wind shuffle the oak leaves overhead, buying time neither of us could afford. I wanted to reach for his hand, the hand that once gripped mine as we crossed streets, but I held back because the boy I raised might be gone. He said, "Mama, I was trying to help," but the word help bent in my ears like it was hollow. I asked, "Who told you forging my name was help?" And he looked away again. The silence stretched so far it nearly broke. He started explaining with words that slid like oil, slippery and rehearsed, telling me bills were stacking, that creditors didn't wait, and he thought stepping in would protect me. I listened but kept my eyes locked on his face, hunting for the twitch or blink that would betray his story. He said the bank just needed a signature, that the church only meant to support, and I heard echoes of Roy's excuses woven through his tone. My throat burned because I wanted to shout, but instead I said under my breath, "You used my living name as a dead one." His jaw tightened, a flash of shame or maybe anger, and I couldn't tell which frightened me more. I noticed how his hands clutched his knees, knuckles white, nails biting into skin, a man digging trenches in his own flesh. He told me he never thought I would see those papers, and that confession hung heavy, darker than denial. I thought, "So you didn't think I'd be watching my own life?" He said it wasn't supposed to go this far, and I wondered what far meant in his head. The conversation ended without a real ending, his phone buzzing, his body jerking like escape had been delivered in vibration form. He stood, muttered that he had to go, and left me with the folder still pressed against my lap like a shield. I watched his back retreat across the grass, the wind tossing his shirt against his frame, and I saw both the child I carried and the stranger he'd become. My breath came shallow, my ribs aching as if grief could bruise bone. I whispered to the empty bench, "If you wanted to help, you should have asked." The oak leaves rattled overhead, no comfort in their song. I gathered my papers and walked to the car, the path blurred as if the ground itself didn't want to hold me steady. Driving home, I replayed every word, every glance, every half-truth, until my head pounded. The house looked smaller when I pulled into the driveway, as though betrayal had shrunk the walls. Inside, the quiet pressed hard, the kind of quiet that demands you fill it with answers. I laid out the evidence one more time, each page accusing in silence, forcing myself to look at the forged lines, the notary's tilted stamp, Roy's careful evasions, and Malik's restless eyes. Together they built a picture, but the center was still blank, a hole where motive should be. Money was the surface excuse, but money doesn't explain obituaries printed while I still breathed. I thought about insurance, about trusts, about the way paper can be more lethal than any weapon when wielded by someone who knows how. I ran my fingers across the ink like it might speak, but ink is mute. Only people talk, and people lie. I wrote down every phrase Malik had used, underlining the one that gutted me most. "I never thought you'd see." That meant someone else was supposed to hold the truth, not me. I asked myself out loud, who was this all meant for, if not me? The question echoed back unanswered. That night, I couldn't sleep, the folder glowing in my mind like a lantern that refused to dim. I made tea, its steam curling like ghosts, and sat in the dark kitchen tracing possibilities. Roy's hesitation, Malik's half-confession, Jacob's notary services careless stamp. Threads leading somewhere I hadn't reached yet. The air smelled of mint and metal, and my heart thudded steadily as if reminding me I was still alive, still fighting. I thought of Hattie, Yolanda, and Pearl, of their voices backing me, and I knew I couldn't carry this storm alone anymore. Tomorrow I will call my lawyer, not for advice, but for action, because paper only bows to stronger paper. I imagined walking into his office with the folder clutched to my chest, setting it down and saying, "This is what they tried to bury me with." My fear hadn't vanished, but fear had become a tool, sharpening my resolve. The question that remained, how deep Malik was tied to this, sat in my chest like a stone, heavy but unignorable. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of leather and dust, the kind of smell that says old battles are stored here. I carried my folder against my chest, its edges cutting into my palms like it wanted to remind me this fight wasn't soft. The receptionist smiled politely, but her eyes flicked toward the folder as if she could sense its weight. She led me into a small conference room with a heavy oak table that seemed too big for just one woman and her pile of evidence. When Mr. Gaines came in, he shook my hand firmly, his grip dry, practiced, not surprised by older women carrying storms in their arms. I spread the folder open page by page while he watched without interrupting. The obituary copy, the bank's note about a representative, the mortgage notice, the pharmacy update, all laid out like bones in a body. I felt naked lying there, but also lighter. He adjusted his glasses and said quietly, "Mrs. Delamini, someone has been very deliberate here." His tone told me I wasn't imagining shadows. I leaned forward, asking what deliberate really meant in legal terms. He explained that forging a signature on financial documents was fraud, plain and prosecutable, but the obituary and church matter complicated intent. My stomach tightened as he spoke, because hearing words like prosecutable turned betrayal into evidence, and evidence into the threat of trial. He asked if I trusted my son, and the air felt sharp as I answered that trust was the thing on trial now. His pen scratched across yellow paper as he asked for dates, names, and every detail I had memorized in my sleepless nights. I gave them all, my voice steady, though inside my chest, each memory reopened like a wound. He paused over the notary's name, Jacob's Notary Services, and said he would subpoena her if needed. The word subpoena tasted metallic in my mouth, but I swallowed it and nodded. Then he asked the hardest question. "Do you want to pursue charges if your son is involved?" My throat burned because justice and motherhood had never felt so at war. I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I stared at the crooked stamp on the photocopy, the tilt that told me someone had rushed truth into falsehood. I thought of Malik's face when he said he never thought I'd see, and I wondered if courtrooms ever saw the boy a mother still carried in memory. My hands shook as I folded one page back, covering my name as if hiding it might protect me from my own decision. Gaines watched, patient but firm, the way a man waits for a verdict from a witness he already knows will break. I finally breathed that I wanted the truth exposed, but my son protected himself, if there was still a way back for him. He wrote something down, then looked at me like a man measuring how much strength was left in the woman before him. He said, "The law doesn't bend for heartbreak, but sometimes mercy can be negotiated." His words left me colder than I expected, but also steadier. The fight ahead would not be clean, but I had stepped into it. He advised that we start by securing my accounts, freezing any fraudulent authorizations, and formally alerting the bank's fraud department. My pulse quickened, because action always sharpens fear into focus. He dialed a number on the speakerphone, introduced himself with the kind of authority that makes clerks sit straighter, and asked for immediate confirmation that I alone held access. I listened to the hold music, my breath sinking with each mechanical note, until a supervisor joined the call. They admitted the authorization had been filed by phone, no physical ID verified, just verbal confirmation. I wrote that down in my notebook, my handwriting cutting deep grooves into the paper. Gaines demanded the tape of the call be preserved, his tone sharp as nails, and the supervisor stammered compliance. For the first time, I felt the power of another voice fighting alongside mine. The folder was no longer just mine to carry. It had entered official air, the kind that smells like ink and judgment. When I left his office, the sky had turned heavy, clouds low and restless, as though weather itself mirrored the case. I carried the folder pressed to me, but now it felt less like a burden and more like a weapon sharpened by law. Still, the ache in my chest deepened as I thought of Malik's face when this evidence reached him in court form. The questions roared louder in my head. How much had he done? How much had others done with his silence? And how much of him was still mine to save? Walking to the car, I noticed my hands weren't trembling. Instead, they gripped the keys tightly, sure of their weight. I slid behind the wheel, whispered a prayer not for justice, but for clarity, and started the engine. The road stretched ahead gray and uncertain, and I knew the next steps would bring me closer to answers that might wound deeper than lies. But wounds, I reminded myself, can scar into strength. And tonight, when I laid the folder on the table again, I would not see a coffin. I would see a case. The next morning, I woke to the phone ringing, its shrill tone cutting through the fog of a night without sleep. My heart jumped before my body did, because these days every call felt like a verdict. I let it ring twice more, then answered, my voice lower than usual, braced for another blow. On the other end was a woman introducing herself as an investigator from the bank's fraud department. She said she had reviewed the flagged authorization on my account and needed to verify details directly with me. Her words were polite, clipped, but I heard something underneath, a quiet urgency, like she already knew more than she was saying. She asked if I recognized the date and time of the call used to add a representative. I said I remembered the day clearly because I had been home alone folding laundry and had not made calls. She confirmed that the caller gave my social security number, my address, and my birth date without hesitation. The pit in my stomach grew heavier. Those details lived with Malik, not strangers. I asked her straight, did the voice sound like a man or a woman? She hesitated, then said a male voice, mature, steady, and calm. My hand tightened on the receiver as if it could keep me from falling. I asked if she could send me a copy of the audio or transcript, but she explained it would need a subpoena, likely through my lawyer. Her voice softened as she added, whoever called knew how to sound convincing. I thought of Malik's measured tone on Sunday, how he spoke calmly even as his words betrayed me, and the image cut me raw. She warned me to check other accounts, insurance, or utilities, since fraud rarely stops at one door. I thanked her, my throat dry, and promised to follow up. After hanging up, I sat in the kitchen staring at the receiver, its silence heavier than the ringing had been. My tea cooled untouched, the steam gone, and I murmured, how much of me has already been sold? By now, I couldn't sit still, so I drove to the notary's listed office, a small building attached to a strip of faded shops. The sign in the window said closed, but a man sweeping the sidewalk next door told me Jacob's notary services only came in twice a week. He said she was older, near retirement, and sometimes let family handle the stamp when she was out. His words made my skin crawl, because a notary's stamp is supposed to be sacred, not handed out like spare keys. I scribbled the details in my notebook, my handwriting jagged from the rush of anger. Standing there, I felt the weight of invisible hands moving my life around without my consent, casual and careless. I pressed my palm flat against the locked glass door, as if pushing hard enough might unlock what had been hidden. A car rolled by slowly, the driver glancing once, twice, before speeding up. Paranoia whispered, or maybe a warning, and I got back in my car. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older than yesterday, as if betrayal had added years overnight. Back home, I pulled the blinds half shut and spread the papers out again, adding fresh notes about the notary's office. The folder had grown thick, heavy, like it carried not just paper, but proof of every person's choice to look the other way. I drew arrows between names, Roy, Malik, Jacob's notary services, and the bank clerk. Lines that tangled into a web with me caught in the center. I breathed, who else has touched this? Who else profits? The room answered with silence, the clock ticking louder than usual, as if measuring how long I had left to fight. My pen tapped against the table, faster and faster, until the sound became unbearable. I forced myself to breathe, to remember that panic solves nothing, only sharp eyes do. I wrote in bold letters across a page, follow the money, because lies grow where money waters them. And I knew then my next step wasn't just chasing signatures. It was finding the account that waited for my silence. That night, when darkness thickened outside, Malik called. His voice was softer than before, almost pleading, and he asked if we could meet without papers between us. My throat tightened because part of me longed for the boy who once confessed mistakes with downcast eyes and simple apologies. But this wasn't that boy, and these weren't mistakes. I asked him, what else have you done, Malik? He said nothing at first, just breathing heavy into the line, and then he whispered, Mama, you weren't supposed to find out like this. His words hit me like a second obituary, confirming what I had feared since the first forged page. I said, I will find out all of it, with or without you. Silence stretched long. Then he said he'd call again tomorrow, as if tomorrow might soften the truth. When the line clicked dead, I pressed the receiver to my chest and felt the hollow space where hope used to live. The manila case rested in plain sight, heavy with truth, pages rustling in the draft, reminding me that tomorrow was already too late for innocence. I spent the following days circling my living room, restless, every window shade pulled low as if I were hiding from my own shadow. The folder of documents lay on the coffee table, too heavy for paper, and I felt its weight pressing into me even from across the room. Every so often, I'd sit, open it, and read the same pages until the words blurred into meaningless lines. Something was missing, not in the papers, but in the silence around them. Someone had helped Malik. I was sure of it now, because the trail was too neat, too polished. My mind kept replaying the notary's office, the man sweeping outside, and the idea that stamps might be borrowed like spare pens. Who lends out power like that unless there's profit behind it? I thought of the bank investigator's careful tone, the way she chose her words as if afraid to say them plain. Secrets breed in pauses, and I had heard too many pauses lately. Late afternoon brought a knock on the door that startled me so hard I nearly spilled my tea. It was Roy standing there with a forced smile and eyes that avoided mine. He said he was in the neighborhood, just checking on me, but his voice carried that practiced smoothness of someone trying to sell calm. I let him in, though my gut twisted. He sat on the couch where the folder had been minutes before, his hand brushing the cushion like he was testing the ground. He asked if I had heard anything new from the bank, his tone too casual for real curiosity. I told him little, watching his eyes shift when I said the investigator mentioned male voices. He laughed too quickly and said phones distort everything. His words skimmed over me, but I caught the way his left foot tapped, restless, a rhythm of nerves. In that small movement, I felt more truth than in his entire visit. After he left, I walked the rooms of my house, checking each lock, not because I feared strangers, but because I feared the familiar. My reflection in the hallway mirror looked back tired, but also sharper, as if betrayal had carved new edges into me. I whispered to the glass, "Who are you protecting, Roy?" The question hung there, unanswered but necessary. I realized then that truth wasn't going to fall into my lap. I had to shake it loose. So I sat again at the table, pulling out a phone bill, tracing each unknown number like a hunter tracks prints in the dirt. One stood out, a repeated call to a firm downtown, too regular to be a chance. I wrote it down, circled it twice, and felt a small surge of control return. My hand still trembled, but the pen line was steady. The next morning, I dressed in a way I hadn't in months, blazer pressed, shoes shined, hair combed back neat. If I were going downtown, I would carry myself like a woman who belonged in every room she entered. Walking into the office lobby of that firm, I felt eyes slide over me, some dismissive, some wary, but I kept my head high. I asked the receptionist about Jacob's notary services, and her expression flickered before she masked it with a practiced smile. She said Jacob's notary services didn't work there. Never had, but the pause before her words told me she was choosing carefully. I thanked her, left, but lingered across the street watching. An hour later, a young man walked out carrying a briefcase, and I recognized the notary's stamp symbol peeking from a folder he dropped, then scooped up quickly. My pulse raced. Stamps were moving through hands here, not in the sleepy strip mall. The office door shut behind him, and I realized I had found another thread. That night, back in my kitchen, I laid the new clue beside the old papers and let the patterns breathe. A fake office tied to a real stamp, a false signature tied to my son's calm voice, a neighbor with nervous feet. Each piece by itself could be a coincidence, but together they formed a chorus too loud to ignore. I felt sorrow pulse under my anger, because every step forward showed me Malik hadn't stumbled. He had planned with help. I stared at the folder until the words swam again, then murmured to myself, "I will drag every name into the light." The clock ticked steadily, reminding me time was the one thing I couldn't buy back, but I still had breath, still had will. Betrayal had hollowed something out of me, yes, but it had also lit a fire where fear used to sit. And with that fire, I promised myself I wouldn't stop until the last hand in this theft was revealed. I sat at the kitchen table long after the sun dipped, the house wrapped in a stillness that felt almost staged. My pen tapped against the folder, rhythm steady, while my eyes kept circling back to the circled phone number from downtown. I had traced every name, every stamp, every pause in conversation, but I still hadn't traced the why. My chest ached with the weight of not knowing, heavier than the fear itself. Did Malik see me as weak or disposable or both? The thought carved deeper than any forged paper ever could. I said under my breath his name out loud, not to call him, but to hear how it felt, and it echoed sharply in the quiet room. No answer came, only the hum of the fridge, but silence itself had become an accomplice in this story. The next morning, I decided to walk into the bank again, not to speak with an investigator this time, but to watch. I dressed plain, blended with the retirees who came for routine deposits, and took a seat near the lobby plants. From there, I could see the tellers, the private office doors, and the rhythm of transactions. A man I had never seen before entered, carrying the same kind of briefcase as the one I spotted downtown. He moved with a confidence too slick for someone coming to make a deposit. When he spoke to a teller, she nodded quickly and led him to a side room. I caught the flash of a stamp case in his hand before the door closed behind them. My heart thudded so loud I feared the others nearby could hear. This wasn't just Malik's betrayal now, it was a system greased with many hands. I walked out before they saw me, but the image of that case followed like a shadow. On the bus ride home, I thought of Roy again, of his tapping foot, his evasive answers, his sudden appearances. Had he been the one to introduce Malik to these men? Or was he only a middleman paid to keep me calm? My fingers clenched around my purse strap as the bus jolted, anger burning off some of the fear. I remembered something small then. A set of keys Roy once bragged about, jingling them like trophies, saying he could get into any office he needed. At the time, I thought he meant his side jobs fixing things, but maybe he meant something darker. The memory chilled me, because sometimes truth hides in jokes we don't hear properly, and now I could hear it clearly. Back home, I pulled every old envelope Roy had mailed me from the neighborhood watch group, the ones I kept stacked in a drawer. His handwriting, once friendly, looked different now, sharp, almost impatient, like someone rushing. One return address label peeled up at the corner, revealing another layer beneath, with a downtown address, faint but legible. My stomach dropped. Why would a man who claimed to be a neighbor send mail that originated near the same office where I saw that notary stamp? I pressed the envelope flat, feeling its edges, and realized the lie had been under my nose the whole time. Betrayal was never abstract. It had fingerprints, postmarks, and ink strokes. I stared at it until my eyes blurred, and the thought that echoed was simple. I wasn't paranoid. I was finally seeing. That night, I sat with a pad of fresh paper, writing every detail in order, every small clue stacked on the next like bricks. My hand ached, but I didn't stop, because stories untold become weapons in the wrong hands. The more I wrote, the clearer the picture became. Malik hadn't acted alone. Roy was tied to the same office as the forged stamps, and the bank's silence was covering more than negligence. When I put down the pen, the page looked like a map of betrayal, but also a guide to the next step. I felt no victory, only resolve. Sometimes courage isn't fire in the chest, it's steady ink on paper. I looked out the window at the dark street, whispering to myself, tomorrow I carry this to someone who cannot look away. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the tightness in my lungs loosen, not from peace, but from purpose. I picked up the phone late that night, the circled number staring at me like it had been waiting for my hand. My finger hesitated over each digit, the silence of the house so thick it felt like even the walls were listening. When the line clicked, a man's voice answered with one word, sharp and professional, no greeting, no warmth. I didn't speak, only listened, and the silence that followed stretched like a wire between us. Then he said, "Jacobs' firm," before repeating, "Hello?" I hung up, pulse racing, breath shallow. That one word confirmed the office existed, even if the receptionist had lied. They weren't ghosts. They were organized, structured, and bold enough to answer under their own name. I sat there with the phone in my lap, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel powerless. They thought they had written my ending in an obituary, but here I was still breathing, dialing. I remembered every woman I knew from church, from the community center, who had been dismissed when they raised questions. Maybe they didn't have folders of proof. Maybe they only had instincts, but I understood now silence is how thieves survive. And I decided right then that my story would not end in silence. Before bed, I opened the window to let in the cool night air. The street outside was still, the lamplight pooling across the cracked pavement, and for the first time in a long while I felt steady. Betrayal had reshaped my life, but it had also sharpened me, stripped me down to something unbreakable. Tomorrow I will walk into that office again, not as a confused mother, not as a grieving woman, but as someone armed with truth. They might think age makes you weak, but time has made me relentless. And when I closed my eyes, I breathed the same vow I would carry into morning. This ends when I say it ends. I've carried you through my story, and now I want to leave you with what it taught me. Trust can be fragile, but strength is born when you choose not to be silent. I am Zinli, 55 years old, and I have learned that even when betrayal cuts deep, courage and truth can heal what was broken. And here's what I believe now with all my heart. Love is never weakness, silence is never safety, and freedom is knowing your worth cannot be stolen. That's the end of my journey, but not the end of yours. If this story touched you, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment when speaking up felt harder than staying silent? What gave you the strength to choose your path? Thank you so much for being here with me, for listening, and for carrying these lessons forward. Until we meet again, take care of your spirit, guard your worth, and remember you are stronger than you think.